Hello everybody, welcome to Chapter 1 in APEC 3012. This is, Chapter 1 is pretty much just a throwaway chapter. It's just a little introduction to get you excited about it. So we'll keep this brief and try and get you excited about the class. One of the questions you might want to ask is, why should you study natural resource economics? Well, here's a motivational picture. You might recognize this as just up from Tony Grove on the way to White Pine Lake. This was me hiking with my daughter and my dog, and it's just a good illustration of the importance of natural resources. So why study natural resource economics? Well, I think it's interesting. Maybe you do. I hope you do, because many, maybe even most, or all of the things that we care about depend on natural resources. And we depend on natural resources for life itself. We need air and water and land, or we couldn't live. So clearly it's important. The thing that really makes it interesting, though, is that there are difficult trade-offs involved, and this is really at the crux of the class. Natural resources are limited, and they have competing uses. So just as a simple example, here in the West, in Utah, we have a lot of land, but we don't have very much water. And that means we have to make tough choices. We could use water for irrigation and agriculture. We could use it in urban use. We could use it for recreation. We could just let it flow in its natural state for ecosystem health. And the trouble is that we don't have the option of doing all of those things at their full capacity, which means that there are difficult trade-offs, and there are difficult trade-offs with respect to all kinds of natural resources. All right, here's a good picture of here's some pictures that illustrate the trade-offs, right? You just think about a chunk of land, right? You could leave it in a fairly natural state. You could build houses on it. You could use it for agriculture. You could build a big, ugly, polluting factory on it. Although I believe this picture is actually of an industry that is fairly green. I can't remember where I got the picture, but I'm pretty sure it's a factory that's actually super environmentally friendly, even though it looks super ugly. Anyway, some important issues that we'll talk about in the class. You can't talk about natural resources and environmental economics without talking about climate change and sustainability. Economists think about sustainability a little bit differently than other scientists, and one reason is because they make a pretty big distinction between this sort of idea of macro sustainability, so the idea of, is there enough resources to survive, right? That's one big picture sort of way of thinking about sustainability. But then there's sustainability at the micro level in terms of like individual resource management. So here we're just talking about the level of a small ecosystem, or a small, maybe just a state or a country or something like that. We'll talk more about that as the class moves along. Another important issue is property rights. So when you talk about property rights in the realm of natural resources, one of the interesting things is that some natural resources are owned and others are not. So for example, you might own a piece of land that has some trees on it, in which case you own some natural resources, but there aren't ownership property rights for air. And water is managed very differently in terms of usage rights and ownership than other resources. So anyway, the important idea here is this idea of rent seeking. So rent seeking is basically seeking to profit from ownership, or seeking to profit from the rules surrounding the use of the resource. So whether it's an individual or a government or whoever it is that controls the resource, they're going to want to try and extract value from the resource, and that's going to dictate their behavior in economic terms. One particular area of concern is what we know as the tragedy of the commons, right? So the tragedy of the commons is when a resource gets destroyed because it gets overused, and this happens when there are open access resources. So it may be open access because nobody owns it and there aren't any governmental regulations or enforcement to stop the overuse of it. And that's a common problem in natural resource economics, both historically and in the modern world. So we'll talk a lot about that. One other issue is resource preservation. So here's one of the interesting things is that we like to keep track of how fast an economy is growing and how well it is doing and all that sort of thing. And so we have these measures like GDP, gross domestic product. But one interesting thing about this is that if you chop down a bunch of trees in a national forest and then sell those trees on the market, the value of those trees goes into GDP. But what's not reflected in GDP is the fact that you don't have the trees anymore. And so the accounting is a little bit weird. It looks really good for the economy to use natural resources, but we should also be concerned if we just deplete the natural resource stock, right? So if we mine all of our valuable minerals, or we chop down all of our valuable trees, or we divert all of our valuable water, that can deplete the natural resource stock, and it makes us poorer in a way that is not always accounted for in the national income statistics. So that's something else to think about, we'll talk about. There's also this idea of irreversibility, right? There's lots of things that you can do in economic terms to change the natural resource stock, and some of those things might be reversible. Like if you just diverted water for irrigation, well, you could stop diverting the water and put it back in. But if you diverted the water for long enough that all the fish died and it changed the ecosystem, that might be an irreversible change. So even if it's reversible in the sense that you can start putting the water back, letting the water flow again, not all changes are easily reversible. All right, we'll talk about policy issues. How do we decide what is the optimal way to use natural resources? There's going to be a big section on this in the middle of the class. We'll talk about land use, conservation and development. What's the best way to use land? How do we know? And we may touch towards the end of the class a little bit on natural resources and globalization. One interesting thing is that if there's international trade and international migration, then that's going to affect natural resource use as well across boundaries. And that's something to think about. All right, that's the end. Thanks. We'll see you in the next video.